When my wife Eleanor died, the silence in our home became unbearable. The air carried her scent, her laughter echoed in corners, and the spaces she once filled now swallowed me whole. Eleanor was the kind of woman who believed love could heal anything. She'd lost her husband young, raised 2 children on her own, and when we met, she was still learning how to trust again. She used to say I brought peace back into her life, but the truth is, she was the peace in mine. We married late in life. By then, the world had already given us its share of pain. I wasn't looking for more. Just a quiet life, a shared morning coffee. Someone who would understand silence without asking for explanations. And that's what we had, until the illness came. It started with fatigue, then pain, words like terminal that hung in the air like ghosts. I watched her fade slowly, the light in her eyes dimming each day. But even in her final weeks, she smiled more for me than I could for her. Before she passed, she made me promise one thing. Take care of them, she said, no matter what. She was talking about her children, Anna and Luke. They were grown by then with their own lives and ambitions. They loved their mother, I'm sure they did. But even as she lay in bed, frail and fading, I could see the subtle shift in their eyes, the impatience, the quiet greed that people try so hard to hide. I didn't want to believe it. Not then. Not while she was still holding my hand, whispering about love and forgiveness. So I promised her I would care for them, protect them, make sure they were okay. She died 2 days later. The house felt colder after that. Every room felt like a memory I didn't belong in anymore. I tried to keep her promise, invited Anna and Luke over, cooked dinners, checked in on them, tried to bridge something that was never truly there. But grief has a way of showing people's true hearts. Within weeks, they started asking questions about the house, the will, her jewelry. She wanted us to have what's rightfully ours, Anna said once, her tone polished with feigned politeness. Luke didn't even pretend. She built this life before you came along, he told me flatly. Don't forget that, I didn't answer. I just nodded, because I knew arguing would only twist Eleanor's memory into something bitter. They didn't wait long. One afternoon I came home to find drawers open, her personal documents gone. They'd found her will, or rather rewritten their version of it. They had connections, lawyers, and more importantly, no shame, the money, the inheritance she'd set aside for me, the funds from her late husband's estate, the savings she'd protected for our quiet future. They drained it slowly, methodically. By the time I realized the depth of their betrayal, the accounts were nearly empty. I confronted them once. I remember Anna's expression, calm, almost pitying. You don't understand how things work, she said. Mom would have wanted us taken care of. Luke just smirked. It's not personal. It's family. Not personal, that phrase haunted me. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. But I didn't fight back, not then. Because I remembered my promise, take care of them, no matter what. So I let them believe they'd won. I let them have the house, the jewelry, the car. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, surrounded by the few pieces of furniture they didn't bother to take. They thought I was broken. They thought I was finished. But grief changes a man. It strips away the illusions until only truth remains. And the truth was, Eleanor had trusted me with something they didn't know about. A sealed envelope, locked away in a safety deposit box under my name. Inside it was the real will, signed, dated, witnessed. And in that will she had left everything to me. With one clause, upon my death, the inheritance would go to charity. She knew them better than I ever did. She saw the hunger in their eyes, the way they measured affection in assets. So I kept her secret. I carried it quietly, waiting. Watching them live their lives as though their mother's memory was a ledger to be balanced. Then one day, I received a wedding invitation. Anna was getting married, and Luke, ever the loyal brother, was standing as best man. I read that invitation 3 times, then folded it neatly beside the envelope. That's when I knew the time for silence was over, because some promises aren't meant to protect the living, they're meant to defend the dead. The invitation sat on my kitchen table for days before I touched it again. Cream paper, gold lettering, Anna and her fiancé smiling from the photograph tucked inside. The kind of curated happiness that looks perfect only when you don't know the story behind it, the words we'd love for you to join us in celebrating. Our special day stung more than I expected. They had stolen from me, gutted everything Eleanor and I had built together, And yet here they were, inviting me as if nothing had happened. Maybe they thought I'd forgotten. Maybe they thought time could bury guilt the way they buried my wife's memory, beneath designer suits and polished lies. I didn't go to the engagement party. I didn't send a card or a call, but that wedding invitation, it stayed in my hands longer than it should have. It wasn't revenge that made me decide to go. It was something quieter. Something like justice, maybe. A promise trying to keep itself alive through me. For months after they took the inheritance, I had replayed Eleanor's final words over and over. Take care of them. But she hadn't told me how. She hadn't told me that sometimes taking care of someone means forcing them to face the truth they've run from. So, I accepted the invitation, not to celebrate, but to close a chapter. The ceremony was held at an estate outside the city. Elegant, expensive, dripping with the kind of luxury Anna had always craved. Everything about it screamed money that wasn't hers. I arrived early, in a simple black suit, the same one I had worn to Eleanor's funeral. The same suit I'd kept pressed in the back of my closet, like a memory I wasn't ready to touch. The guests barely noticed me at first. A few recognized my face, nodded politely. Some whispered, the old man, the stepfather, the one who'd vanished after the will. I stayed quiet, watching them move about like a performance. Anna smiled for the cameras, and Luke laughed too loudly near the bar. They looked radiant, untouchable. But beneath the gloss I could see it, that same hollow gleam I'd seen the day they emptied her accounts. Greed ages people faster than grief ever could. When the ceremony began, I sat in the back pew, my hands clasped tight around the envelope in my jacket. Inside was Eleanor's real will. The ink had faded slightly with time, but her signature still carried the same grace it always did. Precise, elegant, final. I had read it dozens of times, memorized the lines that mattered. All assets and properties, including accounts and holdings, are to be transferred solely to my husband, James Leland. Upon his death, the full estate will be liquidated and donated to charitable foundations of his choosing. Her handwriting trembled slightly on the last page, where she had added a note, not to her children, but to me. They will never understand why, but you will. For years, I didn't. But sitting there in that church, surrounded by people who worshipped surfaces, I finally did. The ceremony went on, vows, laughter, applause. When the priest asked if anyone had reason these two should not be joined, my pulse quickened. Not yet, I told myself, not yet. The truth has a way of hitting harder when it's least expected. I waited until the reception. The hall was filled with lights and laughter, glasses clinking, photographers capturing moments that would age into lies. I stood near the back, near the gift table, watching them dance. Anna looked so much like her mother in that moment that for a brief second my heart softened, but then I saw Luke whisper something in her ear. She laughed, that same shallow, practiced laugh she'd used when she convinced her mother to sign over her savings for emergencies. That was enough to harden me again. The speeches began. Friends, co-workers, Luke, and finally Anna. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke of new beginnings, of family that stands together. The hypocrisy in her tone was almost poetic, and when she finally raised her glass, I stepped forward. My voice cut through the hum of conversation like a blade. If I may, I said softly. Heads turned. The microphone passed reluctantly into my hand. I wasn't sure I should come today, I began, my voice steady despite the thrum in my chest. But I promised Eleanor I'd look after her children. And I suppose today is as good a day as any to keep that promise. I reached into my jacket and held up the envelope. The music faded, replaced by murmurs. This, I continued, is your mother's real will, the one she left in my care, the one she signed with witnesses before she passed, the one she never trusted you to find. Anna's face drained of color. Luke froze mid-step. She left everything to me, I said quietly, with instructions to give it all to charity after I'm gone. Not a cent to either of you, not because she hated you, but because she saw what I refused to, someone gasped. Cameras stopped flashing. The silence that followed was the kind that bruises the air. She loved you, I said, looking at them both. But love doesn't blind forever. She saw how quickly affection turned into calculation. She knew that what you wanted wasn't her love. It was her legacy. Anna's fiancé shifted uncomfortably. Luke muttered something under his breath, but his voice trembled. I placed the envelope on the head table beside the wedding cake, then straightened my jacket. I kept quiet to honor her memory, but I think she'd want the truth spoken today, before you start a life built on lies. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly I walked away, past the guests, past the flashing eyes, past the whispers that began to ripple through the room. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. The sky was bleeding into dusk, and for the first time in years I felt something close to peace. I didn't need to see their reaction. The truth would do its work without me. Eleanor's voice lingered in my mind, gentle, forgiving, certain. "Take care of them," she had said, and I had just not in the way they expected. I didn't go straight home after the wedding. Instead, I drove to the old park by the river, the one where Eleanor and I used to walk when life felt too heavy to carry indoors. The willow trees were still there, bending low, brushing their leaves across the water like they were whispering secrets to it. For a long while, I sat in the car, the engine off, the night quiet except for the slow ripple of the river. My hand still trembled a little. Not from guilt, not exactly, but from the weight of something final. I had imagined that moment 100 different ways. Sometimes I thought I'd feel triumphant, other times hollow, but what I actually felt was calm, like something that had been locked away in me for years had finally exhaled. I remembered Eleanor's laughter echoing through that park, her hand looped through mine, her hair blowing in the wind. "You always try to fix things with silence," she used to tease. "One day you'll realize that silence doesn't heal everything." She was right. Tonight I broke that silence. And in doing so, I think I finally honored her in a way I hadn't before. When I finally got home, there were already messages waiting on my phone. Dozens of them. Missed calls, voicemails. Some from relatives, some from old family friends. Some from numbers I didn't even recognize. But 2 of them mattered. The first was from Anna. Her voice was shaking, a mix of anger and something that sounded like betrayal. "You ruined my wedding," she said. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think you're some kind of hero? You just embarrassed me in front of everyone I know. You think Mom would have wanted that?" I listened, but I didn't delete it. Her voice reminded me of Eleanor when she was young, fierce, impulsive, too proud for her own good. The second voicemail came later. Luke. His tone was different, quieter, hesitant. "I didn't know, James. We thought, look, I'm sorry. I don't even know what to say." That one I listened to twice. Then I turned off the phone and went to bed. The next morning, the news had already spread. Someone had filmed my little speech at the wedding. The clip had made its way onto social media. Titles like "Man exposes bride and groom at their own wedding," and "Stepfather reveals shocking truth about inheritance." I didn't care for gossip, but the irony wasn't lost on me. They had taken Eleanor's money in secret, and now the world knew exactly what kind of people they were. By the 3rd day, Anna's fiancé had called off the marriage. I didn't celebrate it, not really. I didn't want to see her hurt, even after everything. But I couldn't deny there was a kind of cruel symmetry in it all. That evening, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Anna stood there. Her makeup was gone, her hair loose, her eyes red and swollen. For a moment she looked like the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders while we built sandcastles by the lake. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside silently, motioning her to sit. She didn't. She stood in the middle of the living room, twisting her fingers together, trembling. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "You could have talked to me, to us. You made me look like a liar." I met her eyes, calm but unflinching. "You didn't need my help to look like a liar, Anna. You did that yourself when you forged your mother's signature." She flinched. "I only did what I thought was right. You weren't even blood, James. You had no right to her money." That old pain returned, not sharp, just weary. "And yet she gave it to me," I said softly. "Because she trusted me to protect what she built. Not the money, Anna, the meaning of it. She wanted it to matter." Her lips quivered. "You think taking it away from us makes it matter?" "No," I said. "But letting you use it to destroy yourselves would have dishonored her completely." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, she asked, "Do you hate me?" The question took me off guard. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. This young woman standing in front of me, waiting for an answer that would decide whether she still had a father or not. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you. I just don't recognize you anymore." She swallowed hard, tears gathering but not falling. "I don't recognize myself either," she whispered. Then, without another word, she left. Weeks passed. The house was quiet again, too quiet. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence from before. It was peaceful. I spent my days going through Eleanor's old journals, organizing her things and preparing the donation papers that would transfer her estate after I was gone. It felt right, like setting a promise back in its place. Every once in a while, Luke would call. He didn't say much, just checked in. Sometimes he'd ask about the charities. Sometimes he'd just ask if I was eating properly. There was guilt in his tone, but there was also something else, understanding maybe. One afternoon he came by. We sat in the garden Eleanor used to tend, surrounded by roses she had planted years ago. "I've been thinking about Mum," he said quietly. "She always believed people could change." "She did," I said. "And she was usually right," he nodded. "I want to try, James. I don't know if you'll ever forgive us, but I want to try." I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since Eleanor's death I saw something of her in his eyes. Not her face, but her decency, her stillness. "I don't need to forgive you," I said softly. "Just make sure your mother's name means something again." He nodded, eyes glistening. Months later, I received a letter from Anna, handwritten, no return address. Inside, just a few words. "You were right. I'm sorry. I'm working now, for the first time without help. Mom would have been proud. Thank you for telling the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it." I read it 3 times before setting it in Eleanor's journal. Not for me, but for her. The world doesn't always reward the truth. Sometimes it costs you more than you ever thought you could pay. But now and then it gives something back, not in riches, not in apologies, but in quiet redemption. As I sat by the window that evening, watching the light fade across the garden, I felt Eleanor beside me. Her voice soft and knowing. "You did what I couldn't," she whispered in memory. "You made them see. And maybe that was enough, because in the end, justice doesn't always need applause. Sometimes it just needs a man, tired, flawed, and still standing, to choose truth over comfort." And for the first time since she left this world, I felt her peace settle inside me. It's strange how the world keeps spinning, even after your life has been turned inside out. A few months passed after Anna's letter, and though my days looked ordinary from the outside, something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was grief wearing itself thin. Or maybe finally it was peace. Eleanor's garden had come alive again that spring. The roses she planted had multiplied on their own, spreading across the fence like they refused to be forgotten. Every time I trimmed them, I thought of her, how she nurtured everything she touched, even things that once seemed lifeless. I'd started volunteering at the foundation we'd set up in her name, the Eleanor Grace Fund for Families in Crisis. It was her dream, one she'd drafted in pencil years before she passed. Back then, I couldn't bear to touch those papers. Now I carried them in my briefcase like scripture. On my first day there, a young woman came up to me. She was maybe 25, with tired eyes and a polite smile. "You must be Mr. Harper," she said, "Eleanor's husband. We've heard so much about you." I almost corrected her, "Hey, widower, not husband," but I didn't. For the first time, it didn't hurt to be known that way. She gave me a tour of the small office. Posters lined the walls, families reunited, young mothers starting businesses, letters of thanks pinned beside faded photos. It wasn't much, but it was real. It was hers. When I sat down at my desk, I found a small envelope resting there. No name. Just one sentence on the front. "Some debts aren't paid in money." Inside was a check, a large one, was signed by Luke. My chest tightened. I hadn't asked him for anything. I hadn't even mentioned the foundation. But he'd found it. He'd taken his shame and turned it into something decent. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Good man." Somewhere I knew Eleanor was smiling too. A few weeks later, I saw Anna again. She didn't come to my house this time. Instead, I ran into her at the local market. She was standing behind a small stall, selling handmade candles and little crafts with pressed flowers sealed inside. Her hands were rougher than I remembered, her hair pulled into a messy bun. But her smile, it was real, James, she said, startled but not angry. "I didn't expect—" "Neither did I interrupted gently, picking up one of her candles. "Lavender and oak wood." She laughed lightly. "Her wife's favorite scent." I nodded, feeling that old ache stir. "You remembered?" Her expression softened. I've been trying to remember the good things. Mom always said I was too proud to learn from my mistakes. She said you were stubborn, I corrected with a small smile. There's a difference. She hesitated, then said, I'm sorry. For everything. I know. There was a pause, a long, quiet one that felt heavier than words. Then she said something that caught me off guard. Do you think she'd forgive me? I looked at her, really looked, and for a moment I didn't see the defiant young woman who'd stood in my living room defending a lie. I saw the little girl who used to braid flowers into Eleanor's hair. She already has, I said softly. Eleanor didn't hold grudges. She planted seeds. Anna's eyes filled. Then maybe this is mine, she whispered, gesturing to her stall. Maybe, I said. And maybe it's only the beginning. Later that week, Luke visited again. This time he didn't come empty-handed. He brought me a folder filled with proposals, plans to expand the foundation, raise awareness and collaborate with local shelters. He spoke with a conviction I hadn't seen before. I've been talking to people, Dad. We can make this grow like Mom wanted. It doesn't have to be small anymore. I smiled at the word Dad. It had been years since I'd heard it from him. You're serious about this? He nodded. I've made enough mistakes pretending I knew what mattered. This time I want to build something real. We spent hours at the table, going over figures, brainstorming and dreaming aloud. Somewhere between the numbers and the quiet, I realized something. This and right here was the family Eleanor had believed in. Not perfect, not unbroken, but still trying. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I received a letter from a law firm. The same firm that had handled Eleanor's estate. My stomach tightened as I opened it, expecting some leftover legal matter. But inside was a simple note and a key. The note read, per Mrs. Eleanor Harper's instructions. This key was to be given to her husband 1 year after her passing, and only if he fulfilled his promise. My hands trembled as I turned the small brass key over in my palm. No explanation, no address, just a small tag attached to it, Cottage 17, Willow Grove. Willow Grove was where Eleanor and I spent our first summer together. The thought of going back there sent a rush of warmth and dread through me. The next morning I drove there. The cottage looked exactly as it had years ago, tucked between the trees, its porch still wrapped in ivy. When I unlocked the door, dust rose like a sigh, sunlight spilling across familiar walls. On the small wooden table sat an envelope with my name on it. Her handwriting. If you're reading this, James, it means you finally did what I asked. You stopped carrying guilt that wasn't yours. You chose truth, even when it hurt, and you kept your promise to protect what we built together. You always thought love was about protecting people from pain, but sometimes it's about letting them face it, and still staying close enough to catch them when they fall. Don't close the door on them forever. They'll find their way back. You'll see. By the time I finished reading, my vision was blurred. I sat there for a long time, the sound of wind outside, the faint creak of the floorboards, the echo of her voice in every corner, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not the quiet, contained kind of grief I'd been feeding in secret, but the raw, unguarded kind that felt like release. When I returned home, I called Luke and Anna. I didn't tell them about the letter, not yet. Just invited them over for dinner. When they arrived, awkward and unsure, I didn't fill the silence with speeches. I just cooked, like Eleanor used to. We ate in near quiet, but there was no bitterness this time. Just small smiles. The clinking of cutlery. The unspoken understanding that something somehow had begun to mend. As we finished, I raised my glass slightly. To Eleanor, I said. They both nodded. And in that small flickering moment, I realized something beautiful. Forgiveness doesn't always look like tears and apologies. Sometimes it looks like 3 people sharing a quiet meal in a house that had seen too much silence. Grief never really ends. It just changes its shape. It slips into quiet moments. A familiar scent, an old photograph. The way sunlight filters through the same curtains she once chose. That's how it felt in the weeks after that dinner. Peaceful, yes, but fragile. Like I was standing on glass listening for cracks. Luke and Anna started visiting more often. Slowly at first. A few hours on weekends, then entire afternoons. The house, once so hollow, began to breathe again. Their laughter returned, hesitant but real, echoing down hallways that had known too much silence. Still, a question lingered. Something in Eleanor's last letter had stirred. You stopped carrying guilt that wasn't yours. Whose guilt had it been then? I couldn't stop thinking about the estate papers, about the missing documents, the money that had nearly torn us apart, the odd timing of certain transactions that no one could quite explain. I thought it was over. I wanted it to be over. But love, true love, has a way of pushing you toward the truth even when you've made peace with not knowing. One morning, I went to the foundation early. The air was crisp, dew still clinging to the grass, the city just waking. Inside, I found an old box tucked behind the filing cabinet marked "Personal, e.g. my heart," stuttered. Eleanor's initials. The box was dusty, tied with the same blue ribbon she used for gifts. I hesitated before untying it, half afraid of what it might hold. Inside were papers, her handwriting all over them, and at the bottom a sealed envelope addressed to attorney Mark Davies. Curiosity tugged at me. Mark was our family lawyer, the same man who'd sent me the key to the cottage. I decided to visit him that afternoon. Mark looked older than I remembered, his office lined with more books, quieter. He smiled when he saw me. "James Harper," he said warmly. "I was wondering when you'd come by." I placed the envelope on his desk. "I found this in Eleanor's things." He studied it, sighed, and nodded slowly. "She told me you might." "Sit down." He slid the letter opener across the desk. My hand trembled as I sliced it open. Inside was a letter, not to him, but to me. Another one. "James, if you're reading this, it means you've begun to forgive them. Good, that's what I wanted. But there's one more truth you deserve to know. Not to reopen wounds, but to close them properly. The inheritance, the money, the house, it was never truly about them. It was about you. I saw the way you sacrificed for everyone, the way you built your life around others' needs, and I couldn't let that be your legacy. What Anna and Luke thought was their inheritance was never meant to be theirs outright. I structured it so it could only be accessed through the foundation, through compassion, through giving. If they wanted the wealth, they'd have to learn generosity first. You always believed in honesty, so here's mine. I didn't trust them to love you right away, but I trusted you to lead them back to love. By the time I finished reading, I couldn't speak. My throat closed up and I sat there in silence, the paper trembling between my fingers. Mark leaned back. "She planned everything, James, every clause, every condition. She knew they'd stumble, but she also knew you'd be strong enough to guide them back." I let out a shaky breath. "She wanted me to forgive them. She wanted you to teach them what forgiveness looks like," he corrected gently. I left his office that day feeling like I was walking through fog, stunned, humbled, broken open all over again. But beneath the ache was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. That evening I called Luke and Anna again. "Come by tomorrow," I told them. "There's something I want to show you." They arrived at noon, both a little wary, as if expecting confrontation. I led them into the study, the same room where I'd once confronted them about the inheritance. But this time the energy was different. No anger, no resentment, just quiet gravity. I placed Eleanor's letter on the table. "This," I said softly, "was from your mother." They exchanged uncertain glances before sitting down. I watched their expressions shift as they read. The guilt that crossed Anna's face was immediate. Her lips quivered, her hands clutching the paper as if it burned. Luke sat still, his jaw clenched, eyes wet. When they finished, I spoke quietly. "She didn't hate you. She never did. She just wanted you to understand what love really meant." Luke's voice broke the silence first. "And we failed her." "No," I said. "You learned. That's what she hoped for." Anna wiped her eyes. "She thought we'd come back to you," I nodded. "And you did." For a long time, none of us said another word. The only sound was the wind rustling through the open window, the faint chirp of birds outside, life still moving forward. Over the next few months, everything changed. Luke took over more responsibilities at the foundation, handling projects with empathy and focus I'd never seen before. Hannah began volunteering too, helping women rebuild their lives after loss. They weren't doing it for redemption anymore. They were doing it because finally they understood. The day we opened the new community center, I stood beside the plaque that read, "In memory of Eleanor Grace Harper, who taught us that love is not about possession, but persistence." I could almost feel her hand slip into mine again, the way it used to on cold nights when words weren't needed. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Anna approached me with something in her hand and a small locket. "Mum's," she said quietly. I nodded. She loved that one. She pressed it into my palm. "It's yours, I think. She'd want you to keep it now." When they left, I opened it. Inside was a small faded photograph, the three of us taken years ago. Eleanor was in the middle, her arms wrapped around them, her smile wide and effortless. I stood there for a long time, letting the past and present blur into one. That night, before turning in, I walked to the garden, to Eleanor's roses. They'd grown thick and wild, climbing the fence like they had a will of their own. I knelt beside them and whispered into the dark, "I did what you asked. Ellie, they came home." The air was still for a moment, and then a breeze passed through, carrying the faintest scent of jasmine and earth. I smiled. "Yeah," I murmured. "I miss you too." It happened on an ordinary morning. No grand revelation, no sudden twist of fate. Just light spilling through the curtains, the kettle whistling in the kitchen, and the faint sound of birds waking the world. But sometimes the quietest mornings carry the loudest truths. I sat by the window with my tea watching the garden. The roses had finally reached full bloom, a soft ocean of red and ivory. Eleanor's roses. I used to think they bloomed for her. Now I realize they bloomed because of her. Even gone, she'd left roots deep enough to survive storms. There was a peace in me I hadn't known in years. It wasn't joy exactly, or relief. It was something simpler. Acceptance, the man I used to be, the one who held on to pain like proof of love. He was fading. I could feel it. The grief that once sat heavy on my chest now felt lighter, more like a part of me than a wound I was fighting to hide. That morning I found myself walking toward the old study again. It still smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume, jasmine and cedar. I opened the window, letting the air in, and noticed the box I'd once packed away after her death. Inside were her old journals, filled with notes, thoughts, and half-finished letters she never sent. One page caught my eye. It wasn't dated, just a small entry in her looping handwriting. "If he ever feels lost, tell him to plant something new. Life only moves forward when we dare to grow again." I read that line over and over until it no longer felt like words on paper. It felt like a heartbeat. That afternoon, I went to the nursery and bought a young oak tree. Small, fragile, with roots barely wrapped in burlap. The shopkeeper asked, "Planting it for someone special?" I just smiled. "Yes," I said, "for all of them." When I returned home, Luke was already in the garden, pruning the hedges, while Anna was helping repaint the porch rail. They looked up, surprised. "What's that?" Luke asked, wiping his hands. "A new beginning," I said simply, holding up the sapling. We planted it together, right in the center of the garden, between Eleanor's roses and the bench she used to sit on with her tea. As we dug, the air was filled with that strange mixture of sadness and peace, the kind that comes when you know you're not erasing the past, just making room beside it. When it was done, Anna stepped back and whispered, "It's beautiful." "It will be," I said. "Give it time." And I meant it, not just about the tree, but about us. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The foundation grew beyond what I ever imagined. Luke led a new mentorship program for young fathers. Anna coordinated a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name. They worked tirelessly, not to redeem themselves, but because they finally understood the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. I became less of a leader and more of a listener. I learned that sometimes the greatest act of strength is silence, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. Then one evening, as autumn painted the world in gold and rust, I received a letter. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. "Dear Mr. Harper, my name is Claire. I wanted you to know your foundation saved my family. I don't have much to offer, but I planted a tree today in your wife's name. Thank you, not just for the help, but for believing in people like us." I folded the letter and smiled. Eleanor's reach had gone farther than I ever could have imagined. I walked out into the garden that night. The oak tree we'd planted had grown taller, its leaves shimmering under the moonlight. It looked strong, defiant even, and beneath it, the roses were still blooming, their fragrance threading through the cool air. Standing there, I realized something. The story wasn't about revenge or redemption anymore. It was about restoration. The truth had shattered us once, yes, but it had also built something far more honest, something Eleanor would have been proud of, A week later, Luke invited me to speak at a foundation event, our largest yet. Hundreds of people filled the hall, faces I didn't know but somehow recognized in spirit. People who had lost, loved and rebuilt. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated for a moment, looking out at the crowd. I didn't have a speech prepared. Just truth. I used to think forgiveness was a gift you gave to others, I said quietly. But I've learned it's really something you give to yourself. When you hold on to anger, it keeps you tethered to the past. When you let go, really let go, you make room for life again. There was silence, then applause. Soft at first, then swelling, filling the room with warmth. I glanced toward the back, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw her, Miss Eleanor, standing there in that pale blue dress she loved, smiling the way she used to when she knew I'd finally understood something. When I blinked, she was gone, but the feeling stayed. That night I returned home and sat beneath the oak tree. The stars above seemed closer somehow, brighter. I closed my eyes and let the wind move through me. "Eleanor," I whispered, "I did it. We did it." Somewhere deep inside I felt her answer. Not in words, but in peace. I realized then that love doesn't die. It transforms. It becomes memory, kindness, legacy. It lives in the people we've changed, the truths we've dared to face, and the roots we leave behind for others to grow. And as I looked up at that young oak tree swaying against the night, I smiled. Because I knew this was what she meant, plant something new. It's strange how time softens even the sharpest memories. There was a time when I couldn't walk past Eleanor's picture without feeling a lump in my throat. Now I find myself smiling at it, as if she's still teasing me about something only we would understand. The oak tree has grown taller now. Its branches stretch toward the house like open arms, and every spring the roses bloom brighter beneath it. People often stop by to see the garden. They say it feels peaceful, though few know the pain that once lived here. Maybe that's what healing truly is, turning sorrow into serenity so deep that even strangers can feel it. Luke visits often. He brings his own children now, 2 little girls who run barefoot through the grass, giggling, chasing butterflies the way Anna once did. Watching him kneel beside them, patient and kind, I sometimes wonder if he knows how much of his mother lives in him. He'll look up and catch me watching, and I'll just nod. That's all we need, no apologies, no grand words. Time has already said everything for us. Anna, meanwhile, has become a voice of hope for so many women. She speaks at seminars, writes articles, and reminds others that even the most broken beginnings can bloom again. She told me once, "Mom's legacy isn't in the foundation. Dad, it's in the way we learn to love again." And she was right, because that's what life taught me. Love isn't always a grand declaration or a romantic promise. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep showing up, even when it hurts. Sometimes it's forgiveness whispered in silence, and sometimes it's planting something new where grief once grew. There's a bench beneath the oak now. I had it built from Eleanor's old writing desk. The wood still carries faint traces of ink from her unfinished letters. On warm evenings, I sit there with a cup of tea, the way she used to, watching the sun sink behind the garden. Now and then, visitors ask about the bench, about the woman whose name is engraved on the brass plate, Eleanor Harper. She taught us to grow through loss. I tell them she wasn't just my wife. She was my compass, my calm in every storm. She believed that people were better than their worst mistakes, and that even betrayal could be turned into something meaningful if you chose grace over revenge. It took me years to understand what she meant. But now, I do. Because grace isn't weakness. It's power wrapped in gentleness. It's the strength to say, "You hurt me, but I'll still choose peace over hatred." And that choice, I've learned, rebuilds more than just trust, and it rebuilds your soul. One evening, after everyone had gone, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in looping handwriting that felt oddly familiar. Inside was a photograph. It showed a small community center with a plaque on the wall, the Eleanor Harper Initiative for families finding their way back home. Below it was a note, typed neatly, "Because of her story, I didn't give up on mine." I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. Then I looked out the window. The oak tree was glowing gold in the setting sun. That's when I realized something simple yet profound. Maybe we don't get to choose how pain enters our lives, but we do get to choose what it leaves behind. We can let it destroy us, or we can let it shape us into something truer. Eleanor's truth destroyed lies. My truth destroyed bitterness. And together, our truth built something that will outlive both of us. I've come to believe that every betrayal carries a hidden invitation, a chance to discover who you really are when the world tries to break you. For me, it wasn't about exposing anyone or proving my worth. It was about reclaiming my peace. And maybe in some quiet, poetic way, that's the real revenge. To live so fully that those who doubted your strength are forced to witness it bloom. So, if anyone ever asks me what I learned from it all, I'll tell them this. The heart is not made fragile by love, it's made strong by forgiveness. And when you rise after being broken, rise gently, not to hurt, but to heal. Then I'll look toward the oak tree, Eleanor's tree, and know she'd be smiling. Too, because in the end, that's all she ever wanted. Not for the world to remember our pain, but for it to remember that we grew something beautiful out of it. And as night settles, and the stars begin to scatter across the dark sky, I whisper the same words I whispered the night I planted the tree. Thank you, Eleanor, for teaching me how to live again. The wind rustles through the branches, carrying the faint scent of roses and something sweeter. Peace, because some stories don't end in vengeance. They end in understanding. And that, I've learned, is the truest victory of all.